In the 18th century, European empires looked at the indigenous peoples of South America through a strict, uncompromising lens. According to Madrid, you were either living within the geometric order of a mission as a converted Christian, or you were a lost, aimless savage wandering a dark jungle. This strict categorization was a highly useful narrative. It gave the Spanish Empire a moral justification to expand across the continent, framing their mission systems as a necessary rescue operation for populations incapable of progressing on their own. Then, Alexander von Humboldt arrived. Over 5 years, the Prussian explorer mapped thousands of miles of the Orinoco River Basin and the Andes Mountains, carefully documenting both the land and its people. What he documented contradicted the official story. The supposedly civilizing missions were actually freezing indigenous societies in place, while the independent tribes outside the mission walls were living in highly structured, self-sustaining agricultural communities. The European assumptions completely misread the environment. To understand how South America's native peoples actually developed, we have to look at the unique biological and geographic constraints they were operating under. Far from the European imagination of desperate nomads scrounging for food, many independent tribes lived in peaceful, settled villages. This chart compares land footprints required for different survival strategies. It illustrates how the fertile tropics of the Orinoco allowed tribes to cultivate crops like manioc, bananas, and cotton in a tiny fraction of the space required by hunter-gatherers in colder climates. Because their caloric needs were easily met by this efficient agriculture, these independent groups maintained a dynamic lifestyle. They possessed a wide emotional range and an expressive connection to the natural forces surrounding their forest clearings. Inside the Spanish missions, the environment was engineered for the exact opposite outcome. The monks instituted a policy of Vereinzelung, a German term Humboldt used to describe the intentional, systematic isolation of a community. Missionaries deliberately grouped tribes with different languages together or separated them entirely from neighboring groups to cut off trade and communication. Every hour of the day was then locked into a rigid, repetitive schedule of communal farming and structured prayer. Humboldt observed that this endless monotony induced a profound geistige Starrheit. Geistige Starrheit translates to mental rigidity, characterized by a severe intellectual stiffness and an inability to express new ideas. When individuals in the mission struggled to answer simple questions in Spanish, it was not due to a lack of natural intelligence. It was the direct result of spending an entire lifetime in an environment totally stripped of intellectual stimulation, problem-solving, and free movement. The mission system provided a reliable food source and physical safety from tribal warfare, but the price for that daily bowl of maize was the complete paralysis of their cultural and intellectual growth. Looking past the dense tropical forests, the landscape of South America opens up into the Llanos. The Llanos are a vast, flat, grassy steppe stretching across 300,000 square miles of modern-day Venezuela and Colombia. When Humboldt crossed these endless plains, he recognized the exact geographic conditions that produced the Mongol Empire in Asia. Yet he found no massive nomadic armies here, prompting him to ask why the tribes of the Llanos never united into a conquering pastoral society. A split diagram shows the critical difference. Asian steppes had cattle providing milk and cheese. South American plains lacked large milk-producing herd animals. Without this mobile food source, feeding a massive army is impossible. The Llanos populations remained fragmented, incapable of consolidating power. When the European colonizers eventually pushed into the interior, they did not face a centralized, continent-spanning military force. They encountered dozens of isolated groups that could be individually absorbed or displaced. The trajectory of these civilizations was not determined by a lack of capability or ambition. It was dictated entirely by the strict biological constraints of their local environment. This brings us to the ultimate irony of the Spanish missions. Marketed in Europe as engines of modernization, these institutions actually functioned as cultural deep freezes. The missionaries did meticulously preserve native languages, translating them into dictionaries and grammars. But they weaponized these languages as administrative tools to issue orders and manage labor, stripping the dialects of the organic, everyday interactions that keep a culture alive. Meanwhile, the culturally vibrant, independent tribes were steadily pushed off their ancestral lands, forced into the deepest, most inaccessible margins of the Amazon. Humboldt's extensive field notes proved that human development simply does not respond to a rigid formula. You cannot manufacture a thriving civilization through isolation and monotonous daily routines. A society only grows when it interacts dynamically with neighbors, adapts freely to its environment, and exercises intellectual independence. Securing a population's physical compliance behind a wall is entirely different from advancing their society. It is a distinction European empires failed to grasp, and a sociological reality that remains sharply relevant today.